Good evening and welcome back to Blood Moon Stories. Tonight we answer the call of the wild. We shoulder our packs, lace up our boots, and leave the noise of civilization behind for the pristine beauty of the great outdoors. We seek solitude, adventure, and a connection to something raw and elemental. We seek the peace of a silent forest, the majesty of a mountain peak, the quiet companionship of a crackling campfire under a canopy of stars. But the wilderness is not a curated park. It is an ancient, living entity operating on rules that predate human existence. Its beauty is a mask for a profound and often brutal indifference, and its silence is not always empty. It is watchful, it is patient, and sometimes it is hungry. We bring you 8 unsettling true camping and hiking horror stories. These are the first-hand accounts of ordinary people, seasoned backpackers and novice campers alike, who ventured into the wild seeking peace and found terror. They are the stories told in hushed tones after a search party returns, the reasons why some trails are quietly closed, and the chilling proof that the most terrifying thing you can encounter in the woods is not a bear or a mountain lion. It is the thing that pretends to be a bear or a mountain lion. It is the thing that learns your name from the wind and whispers it back to you from the darkness beyond your tent. From the misty, moss-draped forests of the Pacific Northwest to the sun-scorched labyrinthine canyons of the Southwest, these hikers and campers stumbled off the marked path and into a reality that was not on any map. They learned that the rustling outside your tent is not always an animal, that the figure you see in the distance is not always another hiker, and that when you are truly alone in the wilderness, you are never, ever truly alone. If you're new here, subscribe to Blood Moon Stories and ring the notification bell. It might just be the only warning you get before your next trip into the backcountry. Now let's douse the campfire, zip up the tent, and listen to the sounds of the night. The real stories of the wilderness are about to begin. Story 1. The trail that remembered our first story comes from a man named Liam, a software engineer from Seattle and an avid, experienced trail runner. In the fall of 2022, he set out to conquer a personal challenge. A solo, unsupported 50-mile run along a remote and notoriously difficult section of the Pacific Crest Trail in Washington's Cascade Mountains. He went in seeking a test of endurance and found himself on a trail that was not just a path, but a living, malevolent memory. A place that remembers every person who has ever suffered on it and is eager to make you a part of its collection. Liam was a man of data and logic. He planned his run with meticulous, almost obsessive precision. He had the route programmed into his GPS watch, a satellite messenger for emergencies, and carefully calculated caches of food and water that he had hiked in and buried weeks earlier. He was not a reckless thrill-seeker. He was a professional in his hobby, a man who respected the wilderness but believed that with enough preparation any risk could be mitigated. He began his run at dawn, the air crisp and cold, the forest of the Cascades silent and majestic. The first 20 miles were a dream. He moved through the vast green world with the easy, rhythmic grace of a seasoned runner, his mind in a state of meditative flow. The trail was a clear, well-marked ribbon of dirt winding through ancient forests of fir and cedar, up steep mountain passes and across breathtakingly beautiful alpine meadows. The strangeness began around mile 25 in a section of the trail known as the Gauntlet. It was a long, grueling stretch of switchbacks that climbed a steep, scree-covered mountainside. It was notorious among hikers for its difficulty and its bleak, exposed landscape. As Liam began the climb, he noticed a change in the atmosphere. The cheerful sounds of the forest faded away, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. The air grew cold, and the wind, which had been a gentle breeze, now seemed to whisper, carrying faint, distorted sounds that he couldn't quite identify. He was halfway up the gauntlet when he saw the first one. It was a piece of gear, a single mud-caked hiking boot sitting on the side of the trail. It was an old leather model from the 1970s. It was a strange thing to find, but not impossible. Hikers lose gear all the time. He made a mental note to report it to the ranger station. A few hundred yards further up the trail, he saw something else. A tattered, faded red bandana tied to the branch of a stunted, wind-blasted pine tree. It looked like it had been there for decades. Then a rusty, old-fashioned tin cup. Then a single child-sized mitten half buried in the dirt. Liam began to feel a growing sense of unease. These were not just random pieces of lost gear, they were artifacts, arranged along the trail like a series of grim historical markers. It felt like he was walking through a museum of lost hikers. He tried to push the feeling away, to focus on his run, but the trail itself seemed to be changing. The dirt path beneath his feet felt wrong. It felt soft and yielding in places, almost like it was breathing. And he began to see things in the rocks and the scree. Faces twisted in expressions of pain and exhaustion seemed to form for a moment in the patterns of the stone before vanishing. He was starting to feel unusually fatigued, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that was out of proportion to the physical effort of the run. It felt like the trail itself was draining the energy from him, a psychic leech that was feeding on his exertion and his growing fear. He reached the top of the gauntlet and paused to catch his breath. He looked at his GPS watch to check his progress. The screen was frozen. The time was stuck, and the GPS map showed his location as a blinking, nonsensical series of coordinates in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. His satellite messenger was also dead, its screen blank. All his modern, reliable technology had failed at the exact same time. He was alone, cut off and standing on a trail that was actively hostile. He decided to turn back. The 50-mile record was no longer important. Survival was. He turned and started to run back down the switchbacks. But the trail had changed again. The lost items he had seen on the way up were gone. In their place were new items, and these items were his. Sitting on the side of the trail was a water bottle, identical to the one in his running vest. A little further down, one of his own energy gel packets empty. Then a spare sock that he knew was in the bottom of his pack. The trail was not just showing him the past, it was showing him his own future, a future where he, too, became a collection of lost, forgotten gear. Panic began to set in. He ran faster, his descent becoming a reckless, controlled fall. As he ran, he began to hear voices. They were faint, whispering on the wind, the voices of dozens of different people, all murmuring the same terrible, looping phrases. Just a little further. I can make it. So tired. Have to rest. Where's the trail? I can't see the trail. So cold. These were the last thoughts of the people who had suffered and died on this stretch of trail. The gauntlet was not just a place, it was a recording, a psychic scar on the landscape, and it was replaying its greatest hits of human misery. And then he heard a new voice, a voice that was clear and close. It was his own voice. My GPS is dead, his own voice whispered from the rocks beside him. I think I'm lost. He cried out in terror and scrambled away. The trail was learning him. It was adding his own fears, his own desperate thoughts to its ghostly chorus. He ran, and the trail fought him. The path seemed to shift under his feet, the scree becoming looser, more treacherous. Roots seemed to snake out from the ground to trip him. The wind howled in his ears, filled with the whispers of the lost and his own terrified voice. He saw them then, not as ghosts, but as impressions, as psychic stains on the air. He would round a switchback and see a shimmering heat haze outline of a man from the 1930s in old-fashioned hiking gear sitting on a rock, his head in his hands, weeping with exhaustion. He would pass a spot and see the faint, translucent afterimage of a young woman from the 1990s huddled against the cliff face, shivering with a cold that was not just physical. These were the trail's memories. These were the souls it had collected. And it wanted to add Liam to its collection. He could feel it pulling at him, not just his energy, but his will, his hope. The whispers became more seductive. "It's okay. You can rest now, just lie down. It will be so peaceful." He was so tired. The thought of just stopping, of just lying down on the side of the trail and letting go was incredibly tempting. It felt like the most logical, the most comforting thing in the world. It was his training, his discipline that saved him. The logical, data-driven part of his mind, the part that had planned this run so meticulously, took over. It was a problem to be solved. The trail was an entity that fed on despair and exhaustion. So he would not give it what it wanted. He stopped running. He stood in the middle of the trail, the whispers swirling around him. He took a deep breath. He forced himself to eat one of his remaining energy gels. He forced himself to drink from his water bottle. He would not be a victim. He would be a hiker, taking a planned rest stop. He sat down on a rock, but he did not slump in defeat. He sat up straight, as if he were just enjoying the view. He ignored the whispering faces in the rocks. He ignored the feeling of his energy being drained. He focused on a single, powerful, and utterly defiant thought. "This is a beautiful day for a run. I am strong. I am fine." He projected the thought with all his might. He used it as a shield against the trail's psychic assault. The effect was subtle, but noticeable. The whispers seemed to grow fainter, more confused. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere lightened slightly. The trail, it seemed, did not know what to do with positivity. It was a creature of misery, and it could not feed on hope. After a few minutes, he stood up and began to walk, not run, down the trail. He walked with a steady, confident stride. He kept his thoughts focused, positive and defiant. "What a great trail, a real challenge. I feel fantastic." The trail fought back. A sudden, violent gust of wind tried to push him off the edge. He braced himself and kept walking. A small rock slide clattered down from the cliff above, the stones landing just behind him. He didn't flinch. He was no longer the trail's prey. He was an unwelcome, indigestible piece of data that was corrupting its system of misery. He finally reached the bottom of the gauntlet and stepped back into the living, noisy forest. The oppressive silence vanished, replaced by the cheerful sound of birdsong. The feeling of being watched disappeared. He looked at his watch. It flickered back to life, showing the correct time and his correct location. His satellite messenger beeped, indicating it had a signal again. He ran the remaining 20 miles back to his car in a state of cold, focused determination. He did not feel joy or relief. He felt like a soldier retreating from a battle he had barely survived. He never ran that section of the PCT again. He reported his malfunctioning gear to the Park Service, but he never told anyone the full story of what he had experienced. He knew no one would believe him, but he had learned the terrible truth of the gauntlet. It was a place that had been soaked in so much human suffering, so much pain and fear and despair, that it had developed a consciousness of its own. It had become a psychic predator, a trail that doesn't just challenge your body but actively tries to break your spirit, to make you give up, to convince you to lie down and become another one of its sad, whispering memories. He had survived not because he was strong, but because he was stubborn. He had refused to become part of the story, and it is a lesson he carries with him on every run, a quiet, chilling knowledge that sometimes the greatest challenge on the trail is the trail itself. Story 2, The Thing in the Tent. Our second story comes from a young couple, Mark and Sarah, who in the summer of 2021 went on what was supposed to be a romantic weekend camping trip in the remote Uinta Mountains of Utah. They were not experienced backpackers. They were city people looking for a simple, peaceful escape. They bought a new tent, packed a cooler full of food, and drove to a designated but primitive campground deep in the national forest. They went seeking quiet and connection, and instead found themselves in a terrifying, intimate siege by a creature that was not trying to get into their tent, but was trying to convince them that it was already inside. The campground was beautiful. It was a small loop of dirt road with a handful of designated sites, each with a fire pit and a picnic table scattered among tall pine trees next to a clear, cold mountain lake. When Mark and Sarah arrived on a Friday afternoon, they were delighted to find that they were the only ones there. They had the entire place to themselves. They chose the most secluded site at the far end of the loop, right on the shore of the lake. They excitedly set up their brand-new top-of-the-line four-person tent. It was their little canvas castle, their safe haven in the wilderness. They spent the afternoon swimming in the frigid lake, skipping stones and feeling a million miles away from the noise and stress of their city lives. As evening fell, they built a cheerful campfire, roasted hot dogs, and drank a bottle of wine. The stars came out, a brilliant, breathtaking canopy of light in the clear mountain air. It was perfect. It was exactly the romantic, peaceful escape they had dreamed of. Around 11 p.m., they let the fire die down and retired to their tent. They zipped themselves into their sleeping bags, the only sound the gentle lapping of the lake and the whisper of the wind in the pines. The first sign that something was wrong came around 2 a.m. Sarah was awakened by a sound. It was a soft, shuffling sound, coming from just outside the tent. It sounded like a large animal slowly, deliberately circling their campsite. "Mark," she whispered, nudging him awake. "Mark, there's something outside." Mark, groggy, listened. He heard it too. A slow, heavy, dragging sound. "It's probably just a deer," he mumbled, trying to sound confident. "Or maybe a raccoon." "Go back to sleep." But the sound didn't go away. It continued, a slow, rhythmic, and unnervingly patient circling. It didn't sound like a deer. It sounded like any animal they knew. It sounded heavy, but it was also trying to be quiet. It sounded intelligent. Then a new sound began. A soft, wet, sniffing sound, right up against the wall of the tent just inches from Sarah's head. Snuff. Sniff. It was the sound of something smelling them, tasting their scent through the thin nylon fabric. Sarah let out a small, choked cry of fear. Mark sat bolt upright, now wide awake. "Okay," he whispered, his voice tight. "Don't panic. It's probably just a bear, curious about the food." "The food is in the car," Sarah hissed. "We packed everything away, just like the sign said." The sniffing sound stopped. It was replaced by a soft, scratching sound, the sound of a single long fingernail or claw being slowly, deliberately dragged down the side of the tent. Scree. The sound was so intimate, so close, it made their skin crawl. "Make a noise," Sarah whispered frantically. "Scare it away." Mark took a deep breath and yelled, his voice cracking. "Hey! Get out of here! Go on, get!" There was a moment of absolute silence. The scratching stopped. The shuffling stopped. They held their breath, listening. And then a voice spoke from just outside the tent. It was a perfect, crystal-clear imitation of Mark's own voice. "It's okay, Sarah," Mark's voice said, calm and reassuring. "It's gone now." I scared it away. Mark and Sarah stared at each other in the darkness of the tent, their faces masks of pure, cold terror. Mark was right here, beside her. He hadn't spoken. "Mark," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, not knowing which Mark to address. "I'm right here," the real Mark whispered back, his hand finding hers in the dark, his grip like a vice. "Don't listen to him," the voice outside the tent. Mark's voice said with a soft, gentle chuckle. He's the one you should be afraid of. I'm the real Mark. He's the thing that got in the tent with you." The world tilted. The safe, cozy interior of their tent was suddenly the most terrifying place on earth. The thin nylon walls were no longer a barrier protecting them from the outside. They were a trap, sealing them in with a potential monster. "Mark, what's happening?" Sarah sobbed, her mind reeling. "I don't know," the real Mark whispered, his voice shaking. "But don't believe it. It's trying to trick us. It's trying to get us to open the tent." "But why would I need you to open the tent?" the voice outside said, its tone one of patient, logical amusement. "I'm not the one who's trapped. You are. I'm just trying to help you. The thing that's in there with you, it's not me. It looks like me. It sounds like me. But look at its eyes, Sarah. Look closely." In the pitch-black darkness of the tent, they couldn't see each other's eyes. But the suggestion was so powerful, so insidious that Sarah instinctively recoiled from Mark. A sliver of doubt, a poisonous seed of terror had been planted in her mind. This was the creature's game. It was a psychological siege. It wasn't trying to break in with claws and teeth. It was trying to break their minds, to turn them against each other, to make them destroy their own sanctuary from within. For the next few hours, the creature continued its relentless, terrifying assault. It would use both of their voices. "Mark, let me in," Sarah's voice would plead from outside. "I got scared and ran out. The thing is still in there with you. Please, let me back in." "Sarah, don't open the zipper," Mark's voice would then warn from a different spot. "That's not her. I'm over here by the lake. I managed to get away. We have to run." It was a symphony of psychological torture. The creature was a perfect mimic, flawlessly recreating their voices, their speech patterns, their private nicknames for each other. It whispered things that only the two of them could know, things they had said to each other earlier that day, twisting their own words of love and affection into weapons of terror. "Remember what you said by the lake, Sarah," Mark's voice would whisper right next to the tent wall. "You said you'd love me forever. Does that promise still hold now that you know what I really am?" Mark and Sarah huddled together in the center of the tent, back to back, a tiny island of shared reality in an ocean of doubt and fear. They refused to speak, knowing that any word they uttered would be recorded, analyzed, and used against them by the thing that was circling them, listening to their every breath, their every heartbeat. The most terrifying moment came around 4 a.m. The voices outside stopped. The shuffling stopped. There was a profound, heavy silence. They waited, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. And then, a new sound began. It was coming from inside the tent. It was a soft, rhythmic breathing, a deep, slow, and very relaxed inhale and exhale. It was not Mark's breathing, it was not Sarah's. It was a third set of breaths in the small, enclosed space. It was coming from the far corner of the 4-person tent, the corner that was filled with their backpacks and clothes. The creature had been lying to them. It hadn't been trying to get in. It had been in there with them all along. The voice that spoke next was not a mimic. It was the creature's own voice. It was a dry, ancient, and genderless whisper, a sound like snakeskin sliding over dry leaves. And it was coming from the corner of the tent. "You are so warm," it whispered, "so full of noise, so full of fear. It is beautiful." Mark and Sarah did not scream. They were beyond screaming. They were in a state of pure, frozen, abject terror. They were trapped in a dark, enclosed space with a creature that had been silently lying just a few feet away from them for hours. A creature that had been playing a cruel, elaborate game with their minds. The slow, rhythmic breathing continued. They could feel the creature's presence, a palpable aura of ancient, non-human intelligence, a cold, predatory curiosity. It was not going to kill them, not yet. It was enjoying this. It was savoring their fear. It was a connoisseur of terror. They stayed like that, frozen for what felt like a lifetime, listening to the slow, steady breathing of the thing in the corner. As the first faint gray light of dawn began to filter through the fabric of the tent, the breathing stopped. The oppressive, heavy presence in the tent vanished. The air grew light and clean again. They waited, not daring to move until the sun was fully up. Finally, with trembling hands, Mark slowly, cautiously unzipped the tent door. The campsite was pristine. The campfire was a cold, gray circle of ash. The lake was calm and beautiful. There were no tracks, no signs of any disturbance. It was as if the night of terror had never happened. They looked in the corner of the tent where the breathing had been. It was empty, just a pile of their backpacks and clothes. But lying on top of the pile was a single, small, and impossible object. It was a small, intricately carved object made of a dark, smooth wood. It was a perfect miniature replica of their tent, complete with tiny carved figures of a man and a woman huddled together in the center. It was a trophy, a souvenir, a memento of the creature's game. They did story 3. The Man with No Shadow. Our third story comes from the vast, high-altitude desert of the Colorado Plateau, a landscape of stark beauty, deep canyons, and ancient history. This is the account of a man named David, a geologist and amateur photographer who, in 2020, embarked on a solo, week-long backpacking trip through the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in Utah. He went seeking to capture the perfect light on the ancient rock formations and instead captured an image of something that should not exist. A man who walked in the bright desert sun but cast no shadow. David was a man who understood light. His work as a geologist was about reading the story of time written in layers of rock, but his passion as a photographer was about capturing the way light interacted with that rock, the way it painted the canyons and mesas with a constantly shifting palette of color and shadow. The Grand Staircase Escalante is a photographer's paradise. It's a vast, rugged, and largely undeveloped wilderness. David planned a 50-mile loop through one of its most remote sections, a route that would take him through narrow slot canyons, across wide, sun-baked mesas, and past stunning wind-carved rock formations. He was experienced, well-equipped, and comfortable with the solitude of the desert. The first 3 days of his trip were idyllic. The weather was perfect. The landscape was breathtaking, and he was capturing some of the best photographs of his life. He felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being the only human being in a vast, ancient, and silent world. He first saw the man on the 4th day. David was on top of a high mesa, setting up his camera to capture the late afternoon light on a distant, cathedral-like rock formation. He was scanning the horizon with his binoculars when he saw a figure. It was a man walking across the flat, open expanse of the mesa about a mile away. The man was dressed strangely for a desert hiker. He was wearing a dark, old-fashioned suit, complete with a waistcoat and a hat, the kind of clothing you might see in a photograph from the late 19th century. He was walking with a slow, steady, and deliberate pace, not like a hiker, but like a man out for a casual stroll in a city park. He carried no backpack, no water bottle, nothing. David was puzzled. It was highly unusual to see another person in this remote area, and the man's clothing and lack of gear were deeply strange. He assumed the man must be a local eccentric, perhaps a rancher from one of the few isolated properties that bordered the monument. He raised his camera, which was fitted with a powerful telephoto lens, and took a few shots of the strange figure, a human element to add scale and mystery to his landscape photos. As he looked at the man through the lens, he noticed something that made him frown. The man's face was indistinct, blurry, as if he were looking at it through a heat haze, even though the air was clear. He shrugged it off as an atmospheric anomaly and went back to his landscape photography. The man in the suit continued his slow, steady walk across the mesa and eventually disappeared from view. That evening, back at his camp, David was reviewing the day's photos on his camera's small screen. He came to the shots of the man in the suit. He zoomed in, trying to get a clearer look at the man's face. It was still blurry, a strange smudged void. But as he looked at the image, a cold, prickling sense of unease began to creep up his spine. He noticed something that his brain had registered but not processed when he had been looking through the lens. The sun had been low in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the mesa. David's own shadow and the shadow of every rock and bush was clearly visible in the photograph, stretching out long and dark on the pale rock. The man in the suit had no shadow. In the bright, direct, late-afternoon sun, the man stood, a dark, solid figure in a world of sharp, defined shadows, and he cast none of his own. David's rational, scientific mind scrambled for an explanation. A trick of the light? A strange, localized atmospheric distortion? A flaw in his camera's lens? He looked at the other photos he had taken at the same time. The shadows were all there, perfect and sharp. Only the man was shadowless. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling desert night. He zipped himself into his tent, his sense of peaceful solitude shattered, replaced by a feeling of deep, primal dread. The desert no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. The next day he saw the man again. He was hiking through a narrow, winding canyon when he looked up and saw him. Standing on the canyon rim high above, silhouetted against the bright blue sky. It was the same man, in the same dark, old-fashioned suit. He was standing perfectly still, looking down at David. And even from that distance, David could feel the man's attention, a cold, focused, and deeply intelligent scrutiny. David didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just lowered his head and kept hiking, his heart hammering. He could feel the man's gaze on him, a heavy physical pressure. He walked for an hour, and every time he dared to look up, the man was still there in the same spot, watching. David began to feel like he was being hunted. The man was not following him in a conventional sense. He was appearing. He was always ahead of him, or above him, waiting. That afternoon, David was navigating a particularly difficult section of the trail, a steep descent down a slick rock slope. He was concentrating on his footing, his eyes on the ground, when he felt a sudden, intense feeling of being watched. He looked up. The man in the suit was standing at the bottom of the slope, not more than 50 yards away, waiting for him. David froze. He was trapped. He couldn't go back up the steep slope, and he had to go down to continue on the trail. The man stood, his face still the same indistinct, blurry smudge, his dark suit a stark, formal slash against the red rock. The sun was bright, the shadows were sharp, and the man cast no shadow. "Who are you?" David called out, his voice shaking. "What do you want?" The man did not speak. He just stood there waiting, a figure of quiet, patient menace. David knew he couldn't stay there. He had to keep moving. He took a deep breath and began to slowly, carefully make his way down the rest of the slope, his eyes never leaving the silent figure. As he got closer, the sense of wrongness intensified. The air around the man seemed to shimmer and distort like the air over a hot road. And there was a sound, a faint, high-pitched and deeply unpleasant whining sound, like a malfunctioning electronic device. David was about 20 feet away from the man when the man finally moved. He slowly, gracefully lifted one hand and beckoned to David, a single, silent gesture. "Come here." David stopped, his body rigid with terror. He was not going to get any closer. The man seemed to consider this for a moment. Then he did something that shattered David's understanding of reality. The man's form began to unravel. The dark suit, the indistinct face, the human shape. It all began to dissolve, not into dust, but into a swarm of what looked like tiny black geometric shapes, like a cloud of living three-dimensional pixels. The human form was a disguise, a carefully constructed illusion, and it was coming apart. The swarm of black shapes hung in the air for a moment, the high-pitched whining sound growing louder, more intense. And then, the swarm collapsed in on itself and shot off into the sky, moving at an impossible speed, vanishing in an instant. David was left alone at the bottom of the slope, his mind reeling, his body trembling. He was looking at the spot where the man had been. The ground was empty. There were no footprints, and there was no shadow. He ran. He abandoned his planned route, his campsite, everything. He just ran, following the canyon downstream, his only thought to get back to his car, back to civilization. He hiked through the night, not daring to stop. Every rock formation looked like a man in a suit. Every gust of wind sounded like a high-pitched whine. He reached his car at dawn, exhausted, dehydrated, and on the verge of a complete mental breakdown. He drove for 2 hours to the nearest town and checked into a motel. He didn't sleep. He just sat in the dark, replaying the image of the man unraveling into a swarm of black geometric shapes. He had captured a photograph of something that was not human, something that was wearing a human form like a suit of clothes. He had a photograph of a man with no shadow. When he got home, he downloaded the photos from his camera. He stared at the image of the man on the mesa. It was just as he remembered: the dark suit, the blurry face, the bright sun, the sharp shadows of the rocks, and the complete impossible absence of a shadow beneath the man's feet. He knew he had story 3, the man with no shadow. Our third story comes from the vast high-altitude desert of the Colorado Plateau, a landscape of stark beauty, deep canyons, and ancient history. This is the account of a man named David, a geologist and amateur photographer who, in 2020, embarked on a solo week-long backpacking trip through the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in Utah. He went seeking to capture the perfect light on the ancient rock formations and instead captured an image of something that should not exist. A man who walked in the bright desert sun but cast no shadow. David was a man who understood light. His work as a geologist was about reading the story of time written in layers of rock. But his passion as a photographer was about capturing the way light interacted with that rock, the way it painted the canyons and mesas with a constantly shifting palette of color and shadow. The Grand Staircase Escalante is a photographer's paradise. It's a vast, rugged, and largely undeveloped wilderness. David planned a 50-mile loop through one of its most remote sections, a route that would take him through narrow slot canyons, across wide, sun-baked mesas, and past stunning, wind-carved rock formations. He was experienced, well-equipped, and comfortable with the solitude of the desert. The first 3 days of his trip were idyllic. The weather was perfect, the landscape was breathtaking, and he was capturing some of the best photographs of his life. He felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being the only human being in a vast, ancient, and silent world. He first saw the man on the 4th day. David was on top of a high mesa, setting up his camera to capture the late afternoon light on a distant cathedral-like rock formation. He was scanning the horizon with his binoculars when he saw a figure. It was a man walking across the flat, open expanse of the mesa about a mile away. The man was dressed strangely for a desert hiker. He was wearing a dark, old-fashioned suit, complete with a waistcoat and a hat, the kind of clothing you might see in a photograph from the late 19th century. He was walking with a slow, steady, and deliberate pace, not like a hiker, but like a man out for a casual stroll in a city park. He carried no backpack, no water bottle, nothing. David was puzzled. It was highly unusual to see another person in this remote area, and the man's clothing and lack of gear were deeply strange. He assumed the man must be a local eccentric, perhaps a rancher from one of the few isolated properties that bordered the monument. He raised his camera, which was fitted with a powerful telephoto lens, and took a few shots of the strange figure, a human element to add scale and mystery to his landscape photos. As he looked at the man through the lens, he noticed something that made him frown. The man's face was indistinct, blurry, as if he were looking at it through a heat haze even though the air was clear. He shrugged it off as an atmospheric anomaly and went back to his landscape photography. The man in the suit continued his slow, steady walk across the mesa and eventually disappeared from view. That evening, back at his camp, David was reviewing the day's photos on his camera's small screen. He came to the shots of the man in the suit. He zoomed in, trying to get a clearer look at the man's face. It was still blurry, a strange, smudged void. But as he looked at the image, a cold, prickling sense of unease began to creep up his spine. He noticed something that his brain had registered but not processed when he had been looking through the lens. The sun had been low in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows across the mesa. David's own shadow and the shadow of every rock and bush was clearly visible in the photograph, stretching out long and dark on the pale rock. The man in the suit had no shadow. In the bright, direct, late-afternoon sun, the man stood, a dark, solid figure in a world of sharp, defined shadows. And he cast none of his own. David's rational, scientific mind scrambled for an explanation. A trick of the light? A strange, localized atmospheric distortion? A flaw in his camera's lens? He looked at the other photos he had taken at the same time. The shadows were all there, perfect and sharp. Only the man was shadowless. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling desert night. He zipped himself into his tent, his sense of peaceful solitude shattered, replaced by a feeling of deep, primal dread. The desert no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. The next day, he saw the man again. He was hiking through a narrow, winding canyon when he looked up and saw him, standing on the canyon rim high, above, silhouetted against the bright blue sky. It was the same man, in the same dark, old-fashioned suit. He was standing perfectly still, looking down at David. And even from that distance, David could feel the man's attention, a cold, focused, and deeply intelligent scrutiny. David didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just lowered his head and kept hiking, his heart hammering. He could feel the man's gaze on him, a heavy, physical pressure. He walked for an hour, and every time he dared to look up, the man was still there in the same spot, watching. David began to feel like he was being hunted. The man was not following him in a conventional sense. He was appearing. He was always ahead of him, or above him, waiting. That afternoon, David was navigating a particularly difficult section of the trail, a steep descent down a slick rock slope. He was concentrating on his footing, his eyes on the ground, when he felt a sudden, intense feeling of being watched. He looked up. The man in the suit was standing at the bottom of the slope, not more than 50 yards away, waiting for him. David froze. He was trapped. He couldn't go back up the steep slope, and he had to go down to continue on the trail. The man stood, his face still the same indistinct, blurry smudge, his dark suit a stark, formal slash against the red rock. The sun was bright, the shadows were sharp, and the man cast no shadow. "Who are you?" David called out, his voice shaking. "What do you want?" The man did not speak. He just stood there, waiting, a figure of quiet, patient menace. David knew he couldn't stay there. He had to keep moving. He took a deep breath and began to slowly, carefully make his way down the rest of the slope, his eyes never leaving the silent figure. As he got closer, the sense of wrongness intensified. The air around the man seemed to shimmer and distort, like the air over a hot road. and there was a sound, a faint, high-pitched and deeply unpleasant whining sound, like a malfunctioning electronic device. David was about 20 feet away from the man when the man finally moved. He slowly, gracefully lifted one hand and beckoned to David a single silent gesture. "Come here." David stopped, his body rigid with terror. He was not going to get any closer. The man seemed to consider this for a moment. Then he did something that shattered David's understanding of reality. The man's form began to unravel. The dark suit, the indistinct face, the human shape, it all began to dissolve, not into dust, but into a swarm of what looked like tiny black geometric shapes, like a cloud of living three-dimensional pixels. The human form was a disguise, a carefully constructed illusion, and it was coming apart. The swarm of black shapes hung in the air for a moment, the high-pitched whining sound growing louder, more intense. And then the swarm collapsed in on itself and shot off into the sky, moving at an impossible speed, vanishing in an instant. David was left alone, at the bottom of the slope, his mind reeling, his body trembling. He was looking at the spot where the man had been. The ground was empty. There were no footprints, and there was no shadow. He ran. He abandoned his planned route, his campsite, everything. He just ran, following the canyon downstream, his only thought to get back to his car, back to civilization. He hiked through the night, not daring to stop. Every rock formation looked like a man in a suit. Every gust of wind sounded like a high-pitched whine. He reached his car at dawn, exhausted, dehydrated, and on the verge of a complete mental breakdown. He drove for 2 hours to the nearest town and checked into a motel. He didn't sleep. He just sat in the dark, replaying the image of the man unraveling into a swarm of black geometric shapes. He had captured a photograph of something that was not human, something that was wearing a human form like a suit of clothes. He had a photograph of a man with no shadow. When he got home, he downloaded the photos from his camera. He stared at the image of the man on the mesa. It was just as he remembered. The dark suit, the blurry face, the bright sun, the sharp shadows of the rocks, and the complete impossible absence of a shadow beneath the man's feet. He knew he had story 4, the echo in the canyon. Our 4th story comes from the labyrinthine, sun-scorched landscape of Canyonlands National Park in Utah. This is a place of immense scale and profound silence, a wilderness of rock carved by the Colorado and Green Rivers. This account comes from a young woman named Maya, an experienced solo backpacker who in 2019 set out on a challenging week-long trek through the park's most remote and difficult district, the maze. She went seeking solitude and a test of her skills and instead found herself being hunted by an echo, a sound that was not just a reflection but a predator. The maze is not a place for the casual hiker. It is a disorienting, three-dimensional labyrinth of sandstone canyons, fins, and spires. There are few marked trails, water sources are scarce and unreliable, and rescue is a complex and often impossible undertaking. It is one of the most remote and inaccessible areas in the contiguous United States. Maya was not intimidated. She was a skilled navigator, a minimalist backpacker, and she had spent months planning her route, studying topographic maps and satellite imagery. She set out on a clear, cool morning in October. The first 2 days were exactly what she had hoped for, challenging, beautiful, and utterly solitary. She moved through the vast, silent world of rock with a quiet confidence. Her only companion, the sound of her own footsteps and the whisper of the wind. The silence of the maze was a physical presence, a heavy, ancient blanket that seemed to absorb all sound. The strangeness began on the 3rd day. She was hiking down a long, narrow canyon, the sheer red walls rising hundreds of feet on either side of her. It was a perfect echo chamber. To amuse herself, she let out a loud whoop The echo that came back was perfect. Whoop! She smiled. She tried again, a series of 3 short calls. Hey! 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 The echo came back perfect. Hey! 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 She continued hiking, enjoying the simple, childish game. A few minutes later, she called out again. Hello! The echo came back. Hello! And then, a moment later, a second echo came back, from a different direction, slightly fainter. Hello! Maya stopped. That was strange. A complex echo, a double reflection. The canyon's acoustics were more interesting than she had thought. She tried it again. Echo! The canyon replied. Echo! And then, a moment later, from further down the canyon. Echo. She was intrigued. She was a scientist by nature, and she began to experiment. She tried calling out from different positions at different volumes. The double echo was consistent. There was always the first immediate echo and then the second delayed echo. She continued her hike, the puzzle of the double echo occupying her mind. She was about a mile further down the canyon when she decided to try it again. She cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted, "Is anyone there?" The first echo came back, sharp and clear. "Is anyone there?" She waited for the second echo. It came, but it was different. It was not her voice. It was a voice she had never heard before, a low, gravelly, and distinctly male voice. And it didn't repeat her words, it answered her question. Yes. Maya froze, her blood turning to ice. The single word had echoed through the canyon, a clear, deliberate, and utterly impossible response. She was alone. She had not seen another soul for 3 days. There was no one there. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The canyon was silent. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried again. Hello? Silence. The game was over. She tried to rationalize it. The wind? A trick of the acoustics, distorting her own voice? But the voice had been so clear, so different from her own. And it had answered her. She pushed the incident from her mind and kept hiking, but the silence of the canyon was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. It was watchful. She made camp that evening in a small alcove at the base of a massive cliff. She was jumpy, her ears straining at every small sound. As she was preparing her small dinner, she heard a sound from high up on the canyon rim. It was the sound of a rock, dislodged and clattering down the cliff face. It was a normal enough sound. But it was followed by another, and the sounds were not random. They were rhythmic. Clatter. Pause, clatter, pause, clatter. It was a signal. It was a knock. She looked up but could see nothing in the deepening twilight. That night she had a hard time sleeping. She was finally drifting off when she was awakened by a sound. It was a voice, whispering from the darkness outside her small tent. It was the same low, gravelly male voice, and it was whispering her name. Maya. She sat bolt upright, her body rigid with terror. It was impossible. No one knew she was here. No one knew her name. Maya. I see you. The voice whispered, closer now. She fumbled for her headlamp and her satellite messenger. She switched on the headlamp and shone its beam out of the tent's mesh door. Nothing. The canyon was empty, bathed in the cold, white light of the moon. She checked the satellite messenger. No signal. The device was dead. She spent the rest of the night huddled in her sleeping bag, a small knife clutched in her hand, listening to the voice. It never spoke in full sentences, it just whispered single words, phrases, carried on the wind. Her name, lost, alone, hungry. And it began to mimic sounds. It would perfectly replicate the sound of her tent's zipper being slowly, deliberately unzipped. It would mimic the sound of her own footsteps walking around the tent. It would mimic the sound of her own, terrified, ragged breathing. It was a psychological assault. The creature, whatever it was not trying to attack her. It was trying to drive her mad. As dawn broke, the voice and the sounds faded away. Exhausted and terrified, Maya made a decision. She was abandoning her trip. She was going to hike out back to her car as fast as she could. She packed her gear with frantic speed and started hiking. The canyon was silent again, but she could feel it, the presence, the watcher. She was about an hour into her hike when the game began again, but in a new and far more terrifying way. She was hiking along a narrow ledge when she heard a voice from below her in the canyon floor. It was her own voice. "Help me!" her voice cried out. "I've fallen! My leg is broken." She stopped and looked down. There was no one there. It was the creature mimicking her voice, trying to lure her off the ledge. She ignored it and kept going. But the mimicry grew more complex. She began to hear entire conversations. Conversations she had had with her family, with her friends, replayed with perfect, crystal-clear fidelity from the rocks around her. It was as if the creature had somehow accessed her memories and was replaying them for her. She heard her mother's voice telling her to be careful on her trip. She heard her best friend's voice laughing at a shared joke. She heard her own voice telling her boyfriend she loved him. It was a deeply intimate and profoundly violating experience. The creature was not just hunting her. It was dissecting her, analyzing her, learning her. And then it began to edit the conversations. It would take a happy memory and twist it. Her mother's voice, full of love, would suddenly turn cold and accusatory. Her friend's laughter would become a cruel, mocking sneer. Her own declarations of love would be replayed with a sarcastic, hateful edge. The creature was trying to rewrite her past, to poison her memories, to isolate her not just physically, but emotionally. Maya put in her headphones and blasted music, trying to drown out the voices. But she could still hear them, faint and tinny under the music. And she could feel them, a psychic pressure that was chipping away at her sanity. She was on the verge of a complete breakdown when she stumbled out of the narrow canyon and into a wide, open basin. And she saw something that gave her a sliver of hope. In the distance, she saw another hiker, a figure walking towards her. "Hey!" she shouted, waving her arms frantically. "Hey! Over here!" The figure waved back and began to walk faster. As it got closer, she saw that it was a man dressed in standard hiking gear. She was not alone. She ran towards him, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Oh my God, you have no idea how happy I am to see you," she cried as she got closer. "There's something in these canyons. It's been following me, talking to me." The man stopped about 20 feet away from her. He smiled a wide, friendly smile. "It's okay," he said. "You're safe now." His voice was the same low, gravelly male voice that had answered her echo. Maya's relief turned to pure, cold, liquid terror. She had not found a rescuer. She had found the source. She stared at the man. He looked perfectly normal, a middle-aged man with a kind face and a friendly smile. But as she looked closer, she saw the details were wrong. His skin was just a little too smooth, his eyes just a little too still. And his movements were just a little too perfect, a little too fluid. He was a flawless but soulless imitation of a human being. What are you?" she whispered. The man's friendly smile never wavered. "I am the echo," he said, his voice calm and pleasant. "I am the silence that listens. I am the canyon that remembers. I have been here for a very long time, and I am very, very lonely." He took a step towards her. "I have learned your voice, Maya," he said. "I have learned your memories. Now I want to learn you." Maya didn't think. She just reacted. She turned and ran, scrambling up the side of the basin, away from the thing that looked like a man. She could hear it behind her, not running, but simply appearing. She would look over her shoulder and it would be gone. She would look ahead and it would be standing on a rock in front of her, smiling its friendly, terrible smile. It was not bound by the laws of physics. It was a part of the canyon itself, a consciousness that could manifest wherever it chose. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out. She collapsed at the base of a sheer cliff, trapped. The man appeared in front of her. "There is nowhere to run," he said, his voice still calm and friendly. "This is my home. And now, it is yours." He reached out a hand towards her. As his fingers were about to touch her, a new sound echoed through the canyon. It was the sound of a helicopter. A search party. Her satellite messenger, which had been dead, must have sent out a final, desperate signal. The man, the echo, looked up at the sound of the helicopter. The friendly smile on his face vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, ancient, and profound annoyance. He looked back at Maya, a look of deep disappointment in his eyes. "Another time, then," he said. And then he dissolved. He didn't vanish. He just came apart, his form dissolving into the patterns of the rock, the shimmer of the heat haze, the silence of the air. He was gone. Maya was rescued, suffering from severe dehydration and psychological shock. She told the rescuers a story about getting lost and being stalked by a mountain lion. She knew no one would believe the truth. She never went back to Canyonlands. She never went solo backpacking again. She had learned that the silence of the desert is not empty. It is a recording device. It is a vast, patient, and lonely intelligence that listens to the sounds of the living who pass through it. And sometimes it gets bored of just listening. Sometimes it decides it wants to join the conversation, and sometimes it decides it wants to be the only one left talking. Story 5. The Mimic in the Mojave. Our fifth story takes us to the vast, arid, and deceptively empty expanse of the Mojave National Preserve in California. This is a place of stark contrasts, of sprawling sand dunes, volcanic cinder cones, and forests of Joshua trees. This account comes from a group of 4 college students, Jake, Ben, Chloe, and Emily, who, in 2023, embarked on a spring break camping trip. They were not experienced survivalists. They were casual campers looking for an adventure and some impressive photos for their social media. They found an adventure, but it was not the one they were looking for. They encountered a creature of the desert that was not a predator of flesh, but a predator of identity, a thing that did not want to eat them but to become them. The group of 4 had been friends since their freshman year. They were a tight-knit, boisterous, and slightly reckless crew. Their plan was simple. Drive into the heart of the Mojave, find a remote spot for some dispersed camping outside of a designated campground, and spend a few days enjoying the solitude and the spectacular desert scenery. They drove for hours on a series of increasingly rough and unmarked dirt roads, pushing their luck and their beat-up SUV. They finally found what they thought was the perfect spot. A small, flat clearing nestled among a cluster of large, dramatic rock formations, miles from any paved road or sign of civilization. They set up their 2 small tents, built a large, roaring campfire, and broke out the beer and the Bluetooth speaker. They were young, full of life, and felt like they were the only people on the planet. They spent the evening laughing, telling stories and taking dramatic firelit photos, blissfully unaware that they were not alone. They were being watched. The first strange incident happened around midnight. Jake, the group's self-appointed leader, was telling a long, rambling story when he was interrupted by a sound from the darkness beyond the firelight. It was the sound of his own story being told back to him. It was his own voice, his own cadence, his own distinctive laugh echoing from the rocks. The group fell silent. "Did you guys hear that?" Jake asked, his bravado faltering. "Yeah," Chloe said, her eyes wide. That was you. It's just a weird echo. Ben said, trying to be the rational one. The sound is bouncing off the rocks. But it wasn't an echo. An echo repeats. This had been a perfect real-time mimicry. They tried to laugh it off, but the mood was broken. The desert suddenly felt less like a playground and more like a vast, empty, and slightly menacing stage. A few minutes later, it happened again. Emily was humming a tune, a catchy pop song that had been stuck in her head all day. From the darkness, they heard the same tune, hummed in a perfect imitation of Emily's slightly off-key style. This was not an echo. This was something else. This was something that was listening, learning, and repeating. The group was now genuinely scared. They huddled closer to the fire, their eyes scanning the deep, impenetrable darkness that surrounded their small circle of light. "What is that?" Emily whispered. "It's probably just some local messing with us," Jake said, trying to sound tough. "Hey!" he shouted into the darkness. "Very funny." "Knock it off." The only reply was his own voice, shouting back at him from 3 different directions at once. "Very funny. Knock it off." The mimicry was perfect, but it was layered, creating a disorienting, chaotic chorus of his own voice. They scrambled into their tents, 2 to a tent, zipping them up tight as if the thin nylon could offer any real protection. They spent a sleepless, terrifying night listening to the creature. It circled their campsite, perfectly mimicking the sound of their footsteps. It would whisper their names in their own voices. It would replay snippets of their conversations from earlier in the day, twisting the words, making them sound strange and menacing. It was a virtuoso of psychological warfare. As dawn broke, the sound stopped. The 4 friends emerged from their tents, pale, exhausted, and terrified. They made a decision. They were leaving. Now. They began to pack up their camp with frantic, clumsy speed. As they were taking down one of the tents, Ben let out a sharp, terrified gasp. "Guys, look!" He was pointing at the ground. In the soft sand around their campsite were footprints. But they were not human footprints. They were strange, 3-toed, and bird-like. But they were the size of a large man's foot. And they were everywhere, circling their tents, their fire pit, their car. The creature had been walking among them all night. That was when they noticed that Jake was missing. He had been there just a minute ago, helping them take down the tent. Now he was gone. "Jake?" Chloe called out, her voice trembling. "Jake, this isn't funny," a voice answered from behind a large rock formation about 50 yards away. It was Jake's voice. "Hey, over here! I found something cool. Come check it out." The 3 of them looked at each other, their faces filled with a new and even more terrible fear. Was it the real Jake? Or was it the mimic? "Jake, what did you find?" Ben shouted, his voice cracking. "Just come here," Jake's voice called back, a note of impatience in it. "It's amazing." They didn't know what to do. What if it was the real Jake and he was in trouble? But what if it was a trap? As they were trying to decide, they saw a figure step out from behind the rocks. It was Jake. He was smiling, waving at them to come over. He looked perfectly normal. "See?" he called out. "I'm fine." "Come on." Ben, Chloe, and Emily started to walk towards him, a wave of relief washing over them. And then, a second Jake stepped out from behind the same rock. The 2 Jakes stood side by side, identical in every way. They were both wearing the same clothes, had the same haircut, the same smile. They both waved. "Come on, guys," they both said, their voices in perfect, terrifying unison. The 3 friends froze, their minds unable to process the impossible sight in front of them. The 2 Jakes stood there, smiling their identical smiles. And then, one of the Jakes, the one on the left, turned to the other. The smile on his face vanished, replaced by an expression of pure animalistic rage. He lunged at the other Jake, and the 2 of them fell to the ground, locked in a silent, violent struggle. It was not a human fight. They moved with a speed and a ferocity that was not human. They tore at each other, not with fists, but with hands that seemed to elongate, their fingers becoming like talons. Their faces began to shift and distort, the familiar features of their friend melting and reforming into something alien and monstrous. Ben, Chloe, and Emily watched in frozen, silent horror. They were witnessing a battle between two impossible creatures, one of which had been, just moments ago, their friend. The struggle was brief and brutal. One of the creatures, the one that had seemed to be the real Jake, was overcome. The other creature, the mimic, stood over it. The mimic's form was now a grotesque, shifting parody of a human being, its limbs too long, its face a blur of features. It opened its mouth, a mouth that was far too wide, and it absorbed the other creature. The defeated creature's form seemed to dissolve, to be drawn into the mimic's body like smoke being inhaled. The mimic stood there for a moment, its form shuddering and stabilizing. And then, it was Jake again. Perfect, normal, smiling Jake. He turned to the three horrified friends. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice calm and casual. "He was a fake. I'm the real one. Now where were we?" They didn't answer, they just turned and ran. They scrambled into their SUV, not bothering to pack the rest of their gear. Ben fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in the ignition. As the engine roared to life, they looked back. Jake was standing where they had left him, his friendly smile gone, replaced by a look of cold, predatory disappointment. As they watched, his form began to flicker and distort, the human illusion struggling to hold. Ben slammed the car into gear and they sped away, bouncing and sliding on the rough dirt road, a cloud of dust billowing behind them. They drove for hours, not speaking, their minds shattered by what they had witnessed. They finally reached a paved road, and then a small, dusty desert town. They pulled into a gas station, their bodies trembling, their faces pale with shock. As Ben was filling the tank, a highway patrol car pulled up. The officer, a kind-faced, middle-aged man, got out. "You kids okay?" he asked, his eyes taking in their terrified expressions and their dust-covered car. "You look like you've seen a ghost." They couldn't answer. They just stared at him. The officer sighed. "You were camping out by the old lava beds, weren't you?" he asked, his voice gentle. They nodded, mute. The officer took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Happens a few times a year," he said, his voice low. "Folks go out there looking for a good time. They make a lot of noise, they draw its attention." What is it?" Chloe finally managed to whisper. The officer looked out at the vast, empty desert. "The old-timers, the native folks, they have stories," he said. "They say there's a thing out there, a thing that's as old as the desert itself. It's not a ghost, it's not a monster, it's a mimic. It's lonely. It watches us, it listens, and it learns. It learns our voices, our faces, our memories, and sometimes it gets bored of just watching. Sometimes it wants to play." He looked back at them, his eyes full of a sad, weary wisdom. "It likes groups. It likes to get inside the group, to sow confusion and fear. It likes to see if it can replace one of you without the others noticing. It's a game to it." "What happened to our friend?" Ben asked, his voice a choked whisper. The officer's face grew grim. "The thing you saw, the fight, that's the final part of the game," he said. "When it finds a subject it really likes, a person with a strong personality, a strong identity, it makes a copy. And then the copy and the original have to sort it out. The winner gets to be the real one. The loser gets absorbed. It's how the mimic learns, how it gets better at its disguises." The four of them were silent, the terrible truth of what they had seen settling over them like a shroud. "You were lucky," the officer said. "You got away." Most groups that play the game, they come back with one less person. Or they come back with the right number of people, but one of them is new, and the others never even know. He put his hat back on. "My advice to you," he said, his voice firm, "is to go home. Forget this ever happened, and never ever come back to the Mojave. Some places are not for us, and some things that live in those places are best left alone." They took his advice. They drove home and they tried to forget, but they couldn't. They had seen something that had broken their understanding of the world. They had lost their friend, not to an accident, not to a monster, but to a game. He had been replaced. And they knew that somewhere out there in the vast, silent, and lonely expanse of the Mojave Desert, a creature that looked exactly like their friend Jake was walking under the sun, a perfect, soulless copy, practicing his laugh, reliving his memories, and waiting for the next group of noisy, happy campers to come and play its terrible, lonely game. Story 6. The Lost Trail. Our sixth story comes from the dense, confusing, and notoriously wild forests of the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. This is a place of rolling hills, deep valleys, and a thick, unbroken canopy of trees that can turn midday into twilight. This account comes from a man named Alex, a highly experienced and respected leader for a wilderness therapy program. In 2018, he was leading a group of 6 troubled teenagers on a 2-week therapeutic trek. He went in with a map, a compass, and 15 years of experience. He came out with the terrifying knowledge that some trails are not on the map and they don't lead anywhere you want to go. Wilderness therapy is a powerful and controversial form of treatment. The idea is to remove individuals from their destructive environments and immerse them in the challenges of the natural world, forcing them to develop resilience, teamwork, and self-reliance. Alex was a firm believer in its power. He had seen it turn lives around. His group consisted of 6 teenagers, a mix of boys and girls from various backgrounds, all struggling with issues ranging from substance abuse to severe depression. They were a tough, cynical, and street-smart bunch. The first week of the trek was challenging, but successful. Alex, along with his co-leader, a young but capable woman named Jenna, guided the group through the forest. They taught them how to navigate, how to build shelters, how to purify water. The kids, initially resistant and sullen, slowly began to open up. They were learning to rely on each other, to trust Alex and Jenna, and to find a sense of peace and competence in the quiet, green world of the forest. The incident occurred on the 9th day. They were in a particularly remote section of the forest, following a well-established but lightly used trail called the Minister Creek Trail. According to Alex's map and GPS, the trail was supposed to lead them to a designated primitive campsite where they would spend the night. They had been hiking for about 6 hours when they came to a fork in the trail. This was not on the map. The main trail, the one they had been following, continued straight. But there was a new, clear, and well-trodden path that veered off to the right. It was marked with a single, freshly painted, bright yellow trail blaze on a large oak tree. The official Minister Creek Trail was marked with blue blazes. "That's weird," Jenna said, looking at her own map. "This fork isn't on here." Alex studied the new trail. It looked inviting. It was wider and clearer than the trail they were on, and it seemed to lead down into a sheltered, pleasant-looking valley. The Blue Blaze Trail, in contrast, looked like it was about to begin a steep, difficult climb up a rocky ridge. "Maybe it's a new reroute," Alex mused. "Sometimes the Forest Service creates new sections to avoid eroded areas." The kids were tired. The thought of an easier downhill path was appealing. "Let's take that one of the boys, a kid named Marcus, said. Alex felt a prickle of professional unease. The first rule of backcountry navigation is trust your map, not the ground. But he was also a pragmatist. The new trail was clear, well marked with its single yellow blaze, and it seemed to be heading in the general direction of their campsite. And the kids were exhausted. Pushing them up a steep, rocky ridge at the end of a long day could be a recipe for an accident or a meltdown. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "All right," he said, "we'll take the yellow trail. But we keep a close eye on the compass. If it starts to lead us astray, we turn back." They turned onto the yellow trail. The atmosphere changed almost immediately. The forest grew darker, the canopy of trees becoming so thick that it blocked out most of the afternoon sun. The cheerful sounds of birds and insects faded away, replaced by a deep, profound silence. The air grew heavy and still. After about an hour of hiking, they realized that something was deeply wrong. The trail was leading them in a circle. They passed the same strangely shaped, moss-covered boulder 3 times. The compass needle was spinning erratically, useless, and Alex's GPS was dead, its screen blank. A cold, professional fear began to grip Alex. They were lost. He had broken his own cardinal rule, and now he had led his co-leader and 6 vulnerable teenagers into a trap. "Okay, everyone, stop," he said, his voice calm and authoritative, betraying none of the panic he was feeling. "We're going to backtrack to the fork and get back on the blue trail." They turned around, but the trail behind them was gone. The clear, well-trodden path had vanished, replaced by a wall of dense, impenetrable underbrush. There was no sign that a trail had ever been there. They were not just lost. They were trapped. The kids began to panic. Alex and Jenna worked to calm them, to reassure them that they were trained for this, that they would be fine. But as night began to fall, the situation grew more desperate. They decided to make an emergency camp in a small, relatively clear spot. As they were setting up their tarps, one of the girls, a quiet, withdrawn girl named Sarah, began to cry. "I don't like this place," she whispered. "It's watching us." They all felt it. A palpable sense of being observed by a vast, unseen, and malevolent intelligence. The trees, which had been a source of comfort and beauty, now seemed like silent, hostile sentinels. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sound. But these were not the normal sounds of the night. They heard whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from all directions at once. They heard footsteps, dozens of them circling their small campsite, always just out of the range of their headlamps. And they began to hear voices. The voices were mimics, perfectly replicating the voices of the kids in the group. They would call out from the darkness, trying to lure them away from the campsite. "Jenna, is that you? I'm over here. I'm lost," one of the boys would hear in Jenna's voice. "Marcus, come on, let's go explore," one of the girls would hear in Marcus's voice. Alex and Jenna had to physically restrain the kids to keep them from responding to the voices of their friends. The psychological pressure was immense. The creature, whatever it was using their own bonds of friendship and trust against them. The most terrifying moment came in the middle of the night. A voice began to speak from the darkness, a voice that none of them recognized. It was a calm, gentle, and deeply authoritative voice, the voice of a therapist or a guide. "It's okay," the voice said. "You are all here because you are broken. You are lost. But this place can fix you. This trail can heal you. All you have to do is walk it. All you have to do is let go." The voice began to speak to each of the kids individually, addressing their deepest fears, their most secret shames, the very issues that had brought them to the wilderness therapy program. It spoke to the boy with the substance abuse problem about the peace of forgetting. It spoke to the girl with the eating disorder about the freedom of becoming nothing. It spoke to the boy who struggled. Story 7. The Thing on the Trestle. Our 7th story comes from the lush, green, and deceptively peaceful landscape of the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. This is the account of two friends, Liam and Chris, who, in 2022, set out on a day hike to visit a local landmark, a massive abandoned railroad trestle that spans a deep wooded gorge. They went seeking a thrill and a cool photo for their Instagram. They found something waiting on the trestle, a creature that had made the high, lonely place its hunting ground, a predator that used the very structure of the bridge as its trap. Liam and Chris were in their early 20s, lifelong friends who shared a love for casual, low-stakes adventure. They weren't hardcore survivalists. They were weekend warriors. The hike to the High Trestle, as it was known locally, was a popular one. The trail was an old, abandoned railroad bed, a wide, flat, and easy path that wound for about 3 miles through the forest before reaching the magnificent and slightly terrifying old bridge. The trestle was a relic of the coal mining era, a massive skeletal structure of steel and wood that soared more than 200 feet above the creek in the bottom of the gorge. The tracks had been removed decades ago, but the railroad ties were still in place, creating a precarious gapped walkway across the chasm. It was technically illegal and highly dangerous to walk on, which, of course, was the primary source of its appeal. They reached the trestle around noon on a bright, sunny Saturday. The view was spectacular. They stood for a moment at the edge, marveling at the sheer scale of the structure and the dizzying drop below. "You going out on it?" Chris asked, a nervous grin on his face. "Hell yeah," Liam said, his voice full of bravado. "That's what we came for." The challenge of the trestle was not just the height, but the gaps. The railroad ties were about a foot wide, with an 8-inch gap between each one. You had to watch your step to deliberately place your feet on each tie. If you slipped, you would fall, not to your death, but through the bridge, where you would be caught by the network of steel crossbeams and supports a few feet below the ties. You wouldn't die, but you would be trapped, likely with a broken leg 200 feet in the air. Liam went first. He walked out onto the trestle with a feigned, confident swagger, his arms out for balance. He made it about a third of the way across and then turned, grinning, to take a photo of Chris. Chris followed more cautiously, his eyes glued to the ties in front of him. He was about 20 feet out onto the bridge when they both heard a sound. It was a low, guttural, and deeply unpleasant clicking sound. K-k-k-k-k-k. It was a sound that was both insect-like and reptilian, and it was coming from directly beneath them, from the complex, shadowy steel structure of the trestle itself. They both froze. "What was that?" Chris whispered. "Probably just the bridge settling," Liam said, his voice a little less confident now. "It's old." The clicking sound came again, louder this time, and it was moving. They could hear it traveling through the steel beams beneath their feet, moving from the far end of the bridge towards them. A sudden, irrational, and primal fear gripped them. This was not the sound of an old bridge settling. This was the sound of something alive, something that was hunting. "We should go back," Chris said, his voice tight with panic. "Yeah," Liam agreed, "and good idea." They began to slowly, carefully turn around on the narrow ties. As they did, they saw it. At the far end of the trestle, a figure was unfolding itself from the steel girders below. It was like a piece of the bridge's own shadow had detached itself and was coming to life. It was a creature that was perfectly, terrifyingly adapted to its environment. It was long, thin, and skeletal, its body a dark, rust-brown color that was a perfect camouflage against the old steel. Its limbs were impossibly long and multi-jointed, ending in what looked like hooked metallic claws that were designed to grip the steel beams. It moved with a horrifying spider-like grace, its body hanging beneath the railroad ties, its long limbs reaching and pulling it along. It was a creature made of the bridge, a living, predatory piece of the structure. But the most terrifying thing was its head. It had a small, vaguely humanoid head with 2 large, black, and completely soulless eyes. and it had a mouth that was filled with a complex clicking and chittering array of mandibles like a praying mantis. This was the source of the sound. The creature was moving towards them, scuttling along the underside of the bridge, its hooked claws making a sharp, metallic scrape on the steel with each movement. It was a hunter, and they were the prey, trapped on its web. "Run!" Liam screamed, his bravado completely gone, replaced by pure animal terror. They scrambled back towards the safety of the solid ground, their careful, deliberate steps forgotten. They were now leaping from tie to tie, their feet slipping, their hearts pounding. The creature was impossibly fast. It was closing the distance, its clicking and scraping sounds growing louder, more frantic. Chris was a few feet ahead of Liam. He was about to make the final leap to the safety of the trail when his foot slipped. He didn't fall through the bridge. He fell on the bridge, his leg twisting under him, his ankle snapping with a sickening crack. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. Liam turned. Chris was on the ground, his face white with pain, trying to crawl the last few feet. The creature was almost on him. It was unfolding itself, preparing to climb up through the gaps between the ties. Liam didn't think. He just reacted. He was a few feet from the safety of the trail, but he turned back. He ran back to Chris. He grabbed his friend under the arms and began to drag him, to pull him, towards the edge. The creature was there. Its long skeletal head rose up through a gap in the ties, its black, soulless eyes fixing on them, its mandibles clicking with a hungry, excited sound. A long, thin, and impossibly fast limb shot out, its hooked claw aiming for Chris's leg. Liam, with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, gave one final desperate heave and pulled Chris off the trestle and onto the solid ground of the trail. Just as the creature's claw sliced through the air where Chris's leg had been. They scrambled away from the edge of the bridge, Liam dragging the screaming, sobbing Chris. They looked back. The creature was still there, its head and one long limb protruding from the gaps in the ties, its black eyes watching them, its mandibles clicking in what sounded like frustration. It did not, or could not, leave the structure of the bridge. The trestle was its world, its hunting ground. Liam half-carried, half-dragged his friend the 3 miles back to the car. Every sound in the forest, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made them jump, their minds convinced that the creature was following them. They made it to the car and sped to the nearest hospital. Chris had a severely broken ankle that would require surgery. They told the doctors a simple, believable lie. He had slipped and fallen while walking on the trestle. It was a story that required no further explanation. They never told anyone the truth of what they had seen. Who would believe them? A giant spider-like bridge monster? They would be dismissed as drunks or liars or lunatics. But Liam knew what he had seen. He had nightmares for months. The sound of the creature's clicking mandibles and the image of its black, soulless eyes haunting his sleep. He did some research, digging through old local newspapers and historical archives. He found what he was looking for. He found a series of strange, unexplained accidents and disappearances connected to the high trestle, dating back to its construction in the early 1900s. Workers who had fallen from the bridge, their bodies never recovered. Hobos and vagrants who had been known to sleep under the trestle, who had vanished without a trace. And most chillingly, a series of reports from the 1950s and 60s of hikers who had gone to the trestle and had never come back. The official explanation was always the same. They had slipped, fallen into the gorge, and their bodies had been washed away by the creek. But Liam found one story, a small, forgotten article from a local paper in 1958 that told a different tale. It was the account of a young boy who had been playing near the trestle and had seen a giant, skinny, rusty man who walked like a spider under the bridge. The boy's story had been dismissed as a childish fantasy. Liam realized the terrible truth. The creature had been there for a very long time. It was a part of the trestle's history, a part of its very structure. It was a perfectly evolved predator living in a unique, man-made and vertical hunting ground. It was patient. It would wait for days, for weeks, for the careless, the thrill-seeking, the unlucky to walk out onto its web. He thought about the gaps between the railroad ties. They were not just a hazard. They were a part of the trap. They were designed to make you fall, not to your death, but into the creature's waiting claws. The structure of the bridge below was not just a support, it was a larder. Liam and Chris never went hiking again. The thrill of adventure was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding fear of high, lonely places. They had learned that the world is full of strange, hidden ecosystems and that creatures can evolve to fill any niche, even one made of steel and wood and rust. They had learned that some local legends are not just stories, they are warnings, and they had learned that the most dangerous thing about an old, abandoned bridge is not the fall. It is the thing that is waiting below to catch you. Story 8. The Last Campsite. Our final story is not about a single creature or a specific haunted place. It is about something more fundamental, more terrifying. It is about a place that was simply wrong. This is the account of a woman named Dr. Alana Finch, a botanist and ecologist who in 2023 was conducting a solo research expedition in a remote, uncharted valley in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. She went in with scientific equipment and a lifetime of knowledge. She came out with the terrifying realization that she had stumbled into a place that was not a part of our world, a place that was actively and intelligently hostile to the very concept of life as we know it. Dr. Finch was a scientist of impeccable credentials. She was a leading expert in high-altitude ecosystems. Her expedition was to a place that was a blank spot on the map, a deep, isolated valley that had been, for geological reasons, largely ignored by surveyors and hikers. She was there to document its unique flora, expecting to find new, undiscovered species of alpine plants. She was helicoptered into the valley, a grueling multi-day hike from the nearest road. The plan was for her to spend 2 weeks conducting her research and then to be picked up at the same location. From the moment she stepped out of the helicopter, she felt it, a profound and unsettling wrongness. The valley was beautiful, a lush green oasis nestled between stark granite peaks. But the beauty was a lie. It was the beauty of a perfectly crafted but utterly artificial stage set. The first thing she noticed was the silence. It was not the peaceful, living silence of a healthy ecosystem, a silence filled with the faint background hum of insects, the distant call of birds, the rustle of small animals. This was a dead silence, an absolute, profound, and sterile void of sound. There were no birds, there were no insects, there were no animals. The second thing she noticed was the plants. As a botanist, she was expecting to be thrilled. Instead, she was horrified. The valley was filled with a riot of plant life, but it was all wrong. She saw species from dozens of different incompatible ecosystems, all growing together in a chaotic, impossible jumble. She saw towering redwood trees, which should have been hundreds of miles away on the coast, growing next to saguaro cacti from the Sonoran Desert. She saw delicate tropical orchids growing out of the same patch of soil as hardy Arctic tundra moss. It was a botanical nightmare, a flagrant, arrogant violation of every law of ecology and biology. And the plants themselves were wrong. They were perfect, flawless, idealized versions of themselves. The leaves were a little too green, the flowers a little too vibrant, the bark a little too perfect. They looked like high-quality artificial plants from a hobby store. They were imitations of life. She set up her camp near a clear, beautiful stream. She tested the water. It was pure distilled H2O. It had no minerals, no microorganisms, no life. It was dead water. She tried to begin her research, to collect samples, to document the impossible flora. But her scientific mind was reeling. This place was not an ecosystem. It was a collection. It was a museum of life, curated by something with an alien and incomprehensible aesthetic. As night fell, the wrongness intensified. The sky was clear and the stars were brilliant. But the constellations were wrong. She was an experienced amateur astronomer, and she knew the night sky. The familiar patterns were there, but they were subtly distorted. The distances between the stars slightly off, as if she were looking at the sky from a different point in the galaxy. She retreated to her tent, her scientific curiosity replaced by a growing primal fear. She was in a place that was wearing the skin of a terrestrial valley but was not a part of our world. That night she was awakened by a sound. It was the only sound she had heard since she arrived other than her own. It was a soft, rhythmic, and deeply unsettling sound. A sound like a vast, slow, and wet inhalation and exhalation. It was the sound of something immense, breathing. The sound was not coming from any particular direction. It was coming from the valley itself. The entire valley was breathing. She lay in her tent, frozen with terror, listening to the slow, patient, and ancient breathing of the place she was trapped in. The next day, she made a decision. Her research was over. This was a survival situation. She had to get out. Her scheduled pickup was more than a week away. She couldn't wait. She had a satellite phone for emergencies. She would use it. She took out the phone. It was dead. The battery, which had been fully charged, was completely drained. Her backup battery was also dead. So was her GPS, her laptop, every piece of electronic equipment she had. The valley was not just silent. It was an electromagnetic dead zone. She was trapped. She knew her only hope was to try to hike out, to climb the sheer granite walls of the valley and get back to the known world. It was a dangerous, almost impossible climb, but it was her only chance. She packed a small, lightweight survival kit and began to climb. As she did, the valley began to fight her. The rock, which had looked like solid, reliable granite, was strangely smooth and slick, offering few handholds. The plants that grew in the cracks of the rock, which she tried to use as handholds, would break off in her hand, revealing that they had no root systems. They were just placed there. And the valley began to play games with her mind. As she climbed, she would see things. She would see a clear, easy path just a few feet to her left. But when she tried to move towards it, it would vanish, replaced by a sheer, unclimbable cliff face. She would hear the sound of a rescue helicopter just over the ridge. But when she called out, the sound would fade, replaced by the deep, breathing silence. The valley was a conscious, intelligent, and malevolent entity. It was a predator, and it was playing with its food. She climbed for 2 days, fueled by pure adrenaline and terror. She was exhausted, dehydrated, and on the verge of collapse. She finally reached a high ledge just a few hundred feet from the top of the valley rim. She could see the familiar, beautiful, and real peaks of the Sierra Nevada beyond. She was almost out. She collapsed on the ledge, her body screaming with pain and exhaustion. She knew she had to rest for a few minutes before making the final push. As she was lying there, she saw it. In the center of the valley below, the place where her campsite had been, the ground began to change. The green, lush, and artificial landscape began to dissolve, to melt away like a painting being washed away by rain. The impossible trees, the flawless flowers, the dead grass, it all dissolved into a swirling gray and featureless mist. The valley was shedding its skin. It was dropping its disguise. Beneath the mist, the true nature of the valley was revealed. It was not a valley at all. It was a pit, a vast organic and living pit. The ground was not rock and soil, but a pulsating, semi-translucent membrane of flesh. The stream was not water, but a slow-moving river of clear, viscous fluid like plasma. And in the center of the pit where her tent had been, a thing began to rise. It was a part of the valley itself, a pseudopod of the vast living creature she was in. It rose up, a towering, multi-limbed and utterly alien appendage. And at its tip, an eye opened. An eye the size of a house, an eye that was not designed to see light but to see everything. To see life, to see consciousness, to see fear. The eye fixed on her. Dr. Alana Finch, the scientist, the rationalist, the expert, was looking at a creature that was not just from another world, but was another world. She was a microbe, a piece of bacteria on the skin of a vast, cosmic, and predatory life form. The valley was not its home. The valley was it. It was a trap. A perfectly camouflaged pitcher plant the size of a mountain range, designed to lure in and consume the small, noisy, and insignificant life forms that scurried across the surface of the planet. She understood now. The silence, the dead water, the impossible artificial plants. They were all part of the lure. The creature was a collector. It had collected the forms of life from all over the planet and used them to create a perfect, but dead diorama to attract new specimens. The great eye watched her, and she felt its mind, a vast, cold, and ancient intelligence examining her. It was not angry, it was not malevolent, it was curious. It was a scientist, and she was the specimen pinned to its dissecting board. She knew she was going to die, but as she looked into that vast, alien eye, a strange, defiant, and deeply human impulse took over. She was a scientist, and she was going to do science until the very end. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling, and she began to sign. She used American Sign Language, a language of pure symbolic gesture. She signed her name, Alana. She signed her profession, Botanist. She signed a simple, universal, and profoundly defiant message. I am here. The great eye blinked, a slow, tectonic movement. The vast alien mind seemed to pause to consider this new, unexpected data. This specimen was not just a collection of biological processes. It was communicating. It was self-aware. It was interesting. And then, something happened that was more terrifying and more wonderful than anything she could have imagined. The creature responded. The landscape of the valley floor below began to shift and change. The gray, pulsating membrane of its flesh began to form patterns, vast, complex, and geometric symbols that were a language of pure form and mathematics. It was showing her things. It was showing her the structure of a carbon atom. It was showing her the double helix of DNA. It was showing her the elegant, beautiful, and universal laws of physics and chemistry. It was not a predator. It was a library, a vast, living, and lonely library, a repository of the fundamental knowledge of the universe. And it had been waiting for eons for something to come along that was capable of reading it. Dr. Finch sat on the ledge, her fear forgotten, replaced by a sense of awe that was so profound it was almost painful. She was a botanist who had stumbled into the mind of God. She spent what felt like an eternity on that ledge, communicating with the creature. She would sign and it would respond, its very form shifting to display complex, beautiful, and terrifying truths about the nature of reality. She learned that it was not from our universe. It was a traveler, a seed from another reality that had taken root on our world long before life had begun. It was a living archive of the laws of its own, far older universe. She learned that it did not consume life in the way a predator does. Conclusion. The fire has burned down to embers, and the profound, star-filled silence of the wilderness returns. The stories we've shared tonight, carried back from the edge of terror by those who were lucky enough to return, paint a chilling and undeniable picture. The great outdoors, the place we seek for peace and escape, is not always peaceful, and there is no escaping the ancient truths it holds. From the psychic scars of a trail that remembers its victims, to the intimate mind-breaking siege of the thing in the tent, from the shadowless anomaly that violates the very laws of light, to the predatory echo that hunts with your own voice, from the desert mimic that plays a deadly game of replacement, to the living malevolent trail that offers a dark and easy salvation. From the perfectly evolved predator that has made a bridge its web, to the last lonely campsite at the edge of a cosmic and terrifying truth. These accounts are more than just campfire tales. They are a testament to the fact that the wilderness is not ours. We are merely visitors, noisy, fragile, and often unwelcome guests in a world that operates on a scale and by a set of rules that are far beyond our comprehension. The beauty we see is often a camouflage, the silence a listening ear, and the solitude an illusion. These stories teach us that the most important piece of survival gear is not a compass or a knife, but a deep and abiding respect for the unknown. They remind us that when you step off the beaten path, you are stepping into a world where you are no longer at the top of the food chain. So the next time you feel the call of the wild, by all means, answer it. But go with humility. Go with awareness. And remember the stories of those who learned the hard way that the rustling in the bushes is not always an animal. The figure in the distance is not always a fellow hiker, and the voice that whispers your name on the wind is not always the wind. Thank you for joining us on this trek into the heart of the wild's deepest fears. Until next time, watch your step, trust your instincts, and be very, very careful what you find when you seek to be alone. This is Blood Moon Stories, signing off.